The grandfather clock in the Whitmore Mansion's marble foyer chimed 6:30 in the morning, its deep, resonant notes echoing through the sprawling Beverly Hills estate. Sarah Martinez had been awake for an hour already, her worn Nissan Sentra pulling through the service entrance as the California sun painted the Santa Monica Mountains in shades of gold and amber. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine from the meticulously maintained gardens, a stark contrast to the cramped apartment she'd left behind in East LA, where the smell of exhaust and her neighbors' cooking always lingered in the hallways. At 34, Sarah had perfected the art of invisibility. She moved through the 20,000-square-foot mansion like a ghost, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the Italian marble floors. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pressed and spotless, her presence so seamlessly woven into the fabric of the house that the Whitmore family had long ago stopped seeing her as a person, rather than simply another appliance that kept their world running smoothly. "Sarah," Victoria Whitmore's voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. "The coffee isn't ready, and Charles needs his breakfast in 15 minutes. Sarah didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that reacting to Victoria's perpetual displeasure only made things worse. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," she called back, her voice steady and professional as she quickened her pace toward the gourmet kitchen with its sub-zero refrigerator and marble countertops that cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. Victoria Whitmore stood in the kitchen doorway, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. At 48, she maintained her figure through a combination of personal trainers, yoga instructors, and what Sarah suspected was more than just the occasional cosmetic procedure. Her silk robe probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, and she wore it with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to worry about money a day in her life. "I don't understand why this is so difficult," Victoria continued, her manicured fingers drumming against the granite countertop. "We pay you to anticipate our needs, not to make us wait around like we're staying at some roadside motel." Sarah's hands moved efficiently, grinding fresh coffee beans and preparing Charles Whitmore's complicated breakfast routine. Steel-cut oats with exactly 2 tablespoons of organic blueberries, fresh orange juice squeezed from oranges that cost $8 per pound, and his medication arranged in the small silver dish that had belonged to his grandmother. She'd been doing this exact routine for 5 years, and yet Victoria acted as though it was a constant struggle. "I apologize, Mrs. Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore's breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes, and his coffee is brewing now." Victoria's pale blue eyes narrowed slightly. "See that it is, and make sure you get the guest rooms ready today. We're having important people over this weekend, people who matter, and I won't have them thinking we can't manage our household properly." The dismissal in Victoria's tone was nothing new, but it still stung. Sarah had a master's degree in education from UCLA, earned while working 2 jobs and caring for her mother. She spoke 3 languages fluently and had once dreamed of teaching high school history. But when her mother's diabetes worsened and the medical bills started piling up, Sarah had taken the first job that offered good pay and health insurance. That was 5 years ago, and somehow the temporary solution had become her reality. "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore, I'll make sure everything is perfect." Victoria swept out of the kitchen without another word, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and the implicit understanding that Sarah's best efforts would never quite be enough. Sarah took a deep breath, centered herself, and continued preparing breakfast. She'd learned to find small victories in the perfect fold of a napkin, the precise temperature of coffee, the way she could make the house run so smoothly that the family never had to think about the countless details that made their lives possible. 20 minutes later, Sarah was dusting the living room's priceless antiques when she heard the familiar sound of sneakers squeaking against marble. 8-year-old Dylan Whitmore bounded into the room, his unruly brown hair sticking up in several directions, despite his mother's earlier attempts to tame it with expensive hair products. "Morning, Sarah." Dylan's face lit up with genuine warmth, a stark contrast to the cool indifference she received from the rest of his family. "Did you see the Cardinals game last night? They won in the 9th inning." Sarah smiled, her first real smile of the day. Dylan was the one bright spot in her work life, a reminder that kindness existed even in this marble and gold world that often felt so cold. "I missed it, but I heard it was exciting. Your dad must have been happy." "He fell asleep in his chair again," Dylan said with the matter-of-fact tone that only children could manage. "Mom was mad because he was supposed to go to some dinner thing with her, but he said his back was hurting too much." Charles Whitmore's health had been declining over the past year. Sarah had noticed the way he moved more slowly, The increasing number of prescription bottles on his nightstand, the way he sometimes forgot to eat lunch if she didn't remind him. At 62, the stress of running his tech company empire seemed to be taking its toll, though he'd never admit it to anyone. "Well, make sure you tell him about the game," Sarah said, continuing to dust while Dylan flopped onto one of the pristine white sofas that no one in the family except him ever seemed to actually use. "He'll want to hear about it." "Sarah?" Dylan's voice took on a more serious tone. "Why does Mom talk to you like that?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd always hoped Dylan hadn't noticed the way his mother treated her, but children were more perceptive than adults often gave them credit for. She set down her dusting cloth and turned to face him, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups get stressed about things, and they don't always remember to be as kind as they should be." "But it's not just when she's stressed," Dylan persisted. "She's always mean to you, and to Rosa too before she quit. Dad doesn't talk to you like that." Dylan was right. Charles Whitmore, despite his flaws, had always treated Sarah with basic human decency. He said please and thank you, remembered her birthday, and had even given her a generous bonus when her mother was hospitalized last year. It was Victoria who seemed to view the household staff as slightly more useful than furniture, and considerably less important than her weekly nail appointments. "People are different, Dylan. What matters is that you remember to treat everyone with kindness, no matter what job they do or how much money they have." Dylan nodded solemnly, as if filing away this piece of wisdom for future reference. "I think you're the smartest person in this house," he announced, with the confidence of a child who hadn't yet learned that intelligence wasn't always valued or recognized. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the foyer. Charles Whitmore appeared in the doorway, his usually pressed shirt wrinkled and his silver hair disheveled. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 6 months, his shoulders stooped under the weight of responsibilities that seemed to grow heavier each day. "Sarah, thank you for breakfast this morning. The oats were perfect, as always." His voice carried genuine gratitude, something Sarah had learned not to take for granted in this house. "I need to ask a favor. We're interviewing candidates for a new head of security position today, and I'd appreciate it if you could make sure the East Conference Room is set up properly. Water, coffee, the good china." "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. What time should I have everything ready?" "The first interview is at 10:30. His name is Marcus Thompson, comes highly recommended from military circles. We need someone who can handle the increased security concerns we've been having." Sarah had heard whispers about the security issues, something about threats against the family's business interests, though no one ever spoke openly about it in her presence. It was another reminder of how she existed on the periphery of their lives, trusted with their daily care, but not with their secrets. "I'll take care of everything," she assured him, already mentally running through the preparations needed. "I know you will." Charles managed a tired smile before turning to his son. "Dylan, your mother wants to see you upstairs. Something about getting ready for school." As Dylan reluctantly headed upstairs and Charles retreated to his study, Sarah found herself alone again with the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and the weight of another day stretching ahead of her. She moved through her tasks with practiced efficiency, preparing the conference room, arranging fresh flowers from the garden, making sure every detail was perfect for people who would never know her name. At 10:25, Sarah was putting the finishing touches on the coffee service when she heard a motorcycle pull up outside. The sound was different from the usual parade of luxury cars and hired drivers that typically graced the Whitmore driveway. Through the window, she watched a man in a worn leather jacket dismount from a black Harley-Davidson, his movements precise and controlled, despite the casual nature of his arrival. Marcus Thompson was not what Sarah had expected. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that spoke of military training and hard-earned confidence. His dark skin was weathered by sun and experience, and there was something in his brown eyes that suggested he saw more than most people realized. Unlike the usual parade of business associates who visited the house, he didn't seem impressed by the mansion's opulent display of wealth. If anything, he looked like he was assessing it, cataloging exits and vulnerabilities with the practiced eye of someone trained to protect others. Sarah watched from the kitchen as Victoria greeted him at the front door, her voice taking on the artificially warm tone she reserved for people she considered important. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that Marcus's polite responses lacked the deferential quality that Victoria was accustomed to receiving. He shook her hand firmly, met her eyes directly, and carried himself like someone who'd never learned to be intimidated by money or social status. 20 minutes into what was supposed to be a formal interview in the conference room, Sarah heard voices approaching the kitchen. Charles was giving Marcus a tour of the house, explaining the security challenges and showing him the various entry points that needed to be monitored. "The kitchen staff arrives early," Charles was saying, as they entered the room where Sarah was cleaning up the coffee service. "Sarah's been with us for 5 years, completely trustworthy, knows the family routine better than we do." For the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah found herself being truly seen by a stranger. Marcus's eyes met hers, and instead of looking through her the way most visitors did, he nodded with genuine acknowledgement. "Ma'am," he said simply, his voice carrying a warmth that was both professional and human. "This is Sarah Martinez," Charles continued. "Sarah, this is Marcus Thompson. He's interviewing for the head of security position." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Thompson," Sarah replied, acutely aware that this was one of the rare occasions when she was being introduced rather than simply ignored. "Please, just Marcus." His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his serious features. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. In my experience, the people who keep a household running are usually the ones who know the most about what's really going on." The comment surprised Sarah. Most people in positions of authority treated her like part of the scenery, useful for answering questions about schedules and preferences, but not worth consulting about anything important. Marcus seemed to understand that people like her, the ones who were present but invisible, often saw and heard more than anyone realized. "Sarah's been invaluable," Charles agreed, though something in his tone suggested he was only now really thinking about what that meant. "I don't know how we managed before she arrived." As the men continued their tour, Sarah found herself thinking about Marcus's words. There was something different about him, something that suggested he understood what it meant to be underestimated, to have your worth measured by others who couldn't see past their own assumptions. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like someone had looked at her and seen not just a housekeeper, but a person with value and intelligence. The rest of the morning passed in its usual rhythm, but something had shifted. As Sarah went about her tasks, preparing lunch, organizing Victoria's afternoon schedule, making sure Dylan had everything he needed for school, she found herself thinking about Marcus's direct gaze and the way he'd spoken to her like an equal rather than an employee. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in a house where she'd spent 5 years being treated like furniture, even small recognitions of her humanity felt revolutionary. Sarah didn't know if Marcus would get the job or what it might mean for her daily life if he did, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope that maybe, just maybe, not everyone in this world saw her as invisible. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows as Sarah finished her tasks, each ray of light seeming to carry with it the possibility that change, when it came, might not always be something to fear. 3 days after Marcus Thompson's interview, Sarah arrived at the Whitmore mansion to find his motorcycle already parked in the circular driveway beside Victoria's pristine white Mercedes. The October morning carried the crisp promise of autumn, and the Santa Ana winds rustled through the palm trees that lined the estate's perimeter. Sarah had spent the weekend wondering if she'd imagined the moment of genuine recognition in Marcus's eyes, or if it had simply been professional courtesy from someone trained to assess every person in his environment. The question was answered the moment she entered through the service entrance and found Marcus in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd prepared for the family's breakfast. "Morning, Sarah," he said, looking up with the same direct gaze that had surprised her during their first meeting. "I hope you don't mind. Charles said I should make myself at home while I get oriented." "Of course not. Welcome to the team, Mr. Thompson." Sarah set down her purse and reached for her apron, falling easily into the morning routine that had become second nature over the past 5 years. "Marcus, please and thank you." He leaned against the granite countertop, his presence somehow making the cavernous kitchen feel more human-sized. "I was hoping we could talk sometime today, actually. Charles mentioned you know this place better than anyone, and I'd appreciate your perspective on the security setup." Sarah paused in the middle of tying her apron strings. In 5 years of working for the Whitmores, no one had ever asked for her perspective on anything more complex than whether they preferred their coffee strong or medium. The household staff were expected to observe and serve, not to analyze or advise. "I'd be happy to help however I can," she replied carefully, still not quite believing that her opinion was being solicited by someone in a position of authority. "Great. Maybe we can find some time this afternoon, after the morning rush." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of Victoria's heels clicking against marble announced her approach. She swept into the kitchen wearing a perfectly tailored cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Sarah's car, her blonde hair styled in the kind of effortless waves that required 2 hours and a team of professionals to achieve. "Marcus, there you are." Victoria's voice carried that artificially bright tone she used when she wanted to charm someone. "I trust you're settling in well? Charles is so pleased we were able to secure someone with your credentials. I appreciate the confidence, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm looking forward to implementing some enhanced security measures." Victoria's smile faltered slightly at Marcus's businesslike response. Sarah had observed this dynamic countless times. Victoria expected a certain level of deference from employees, a recognition of her superior social status that Marcus seemed either unaware of or uninterested in providing. "Yes, well, I'm sure you'll find everything here is already quite secure. We've never had any real problems, you understand. Charles can be somewhat paranoid about these things." Victoria's laugh was light and dismissive, but Sarah caught the edge underneath it. "I don't want you to think we're living in some kind of fortress atmosphere." Marcus's expression remained neutral, but Sarah noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "Security is always a balance between protection and comfort, ma'am. I'll make sure any changes are as unobtrusive as possible." "Wonderful." Victoria turned towards Sarah as if suddenly remembering she was there. "Sarah, I need you to completely redo the West guest suite today. Apparently, Charles has invited some business associate to stay for the weekend, without consulting me first. The room needs to be perfect. Fresh flowers, the good linens, and make sure there's no dust anywhere. These people notice everything." "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll take care of it right away." Victoria nodded curtly and headed toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Sarah, try to keep the noise down when you're working. I have a very important conference call this morning with the planning committee for the Children's Hospital Gala. We're expecting to raise over $2 million this year." As Victoria's footsteps faded down the hallway, Sarah felt the familiar weight of being simultaneously essential and invisible settling back onto her shoulders. She began assembling the cleaning supplies she'd need for the guest suite, her movements automatic and efficient. $2 million for the Children's Hospital? Marcus's voice carried a note of genuine interest. "That's impressive." Sarah looked up, surprised that he was still there, and even more surprised that he was engaging her in conversation. "Mrs. Whitmore is very dedicated to her charity work. She's on the boards of several organizations. What about you? Do you get involved in any community work?" The question caught Sarah off guard. No one in this house had ever asked about her life outside of work, her interests or her goals. For a moment she wasn't sure how to respond. "I volunteer at a literacy program in East LA when I can," she said finally. "My mother, she never learned to read English very well after we moved here from Mexico, and I know how much that held her back. So I try to help others who are in similar situations." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's important work, more important than most people realize." There was something in his tone that suggested he understood the weight of systemic barriers and the courage it took to try to break them down, one person at a time. Sarah found herself studying his face, wondering about his own story, his own experiences with being underestimated or overlooked. "I should get started on that guest room," she said, gathering her supplies. "Of course. But Sarah," Marcus waited until she met his eyes. "That conversation we talked about, I meant it. Your perspective on this place, on the family dynamics, on potential security concerns, it matters. Most people in my position make the mistake of only talking to the people at the top, but the real information usually comes from people like you. People like you." Sarah carried those words with her as she climbed the grand staircase to the second floor, her arms full of fresh linens and cleaning supplies. People like her, the ones who saw everything and were trusted with nothing, who kept the world running while remaining invisible to those who benefited from their work. The West Guest Suite was a masterpiece of understated luxury, with hand-painted wallpaper that cost more per square foot than most people made in a week. Sarah had cleaned this room hundreds of times, but she still marveled at the absurd excess of it. A space that sat empty 90% of the year, maintained in perfect condition for the occasional visitor who would likely spend more on a single meal than Sarah made in a month. As she worked, stripping the bed and dusting the antique furniture, Sarah's mind wandered to her conversation with Marcus. For the first time since she'd started working for the Whitmores, someone was asking for her opinion, treating her insights as valuable rather than dismissing her as just another service provider. The sound of voices in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Dylan's voice, high and excited, was followed by a deeper rumble that Sarah recognized as Marcus's steady baritone. And then the pitcher threw a curveball, but the batter was expecting it, so he hit it right out of the park. "Sounds like you know your baseball," Marcus replied. "Do you play or just watch?" "I wanted to join Little League, but Mum says it's too dangerous. She thinks I should focus on tennis or golf instead, sports for people of our caliber." Dylan's impression of his mother's voice was startlingly accurate. Sarah paused in her dusting, listening to the conversation through the partially open door. Dylan rarely talked about his frustrations with his mother's restrictions, but Sarah had noticed how the 8-year-old's natural enthusiasm was gradually being channeled into activities that Victoria deemed appropriate for their social status. "Well, there's nothing wrong with tennis or golf," Marcus said diplomatically, "but baseball's a good sport too. Teaches you about teamwork, patience, dealing with failure." "Sarah likes baseball," Dylan announced. "She taught me how to throw a proper curveball in the backyard when Mum wasn't watching." Sarah felt a flush of warmth at Dylan's words, followed immediately by a spike of anxiety. Victoria would not be pleased to know that Sarah had been teaching Dylan skills that contradicted her carefully planned athletic development program. "Is that right?" Marcus's voice carried a note of interest. "Sarah seems to know a lot about a lot of things. She's really smart," Dylan said with the matter-of-fact confidence of childhood. "She helped me with my history project about World War II, and she knew all about the battles and everything. She said her grandfather fought in the Pacific Theater, whatever that means. The Pacific Theater was where American forces fought against Japan," Marcus explained. "Your grandfather must have been a brave man fighting in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Sarah showed me pictures of him in his uniform. He looked really young, younger than my dad is now. She said he came back different, though, sadder." Sarah set down her dusting cloth, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. She rarely talked about her grandfather, who had returned from the war with what people now understood as PTSD, but what was then simply called being changed by the war. He'd struggled for years to readjust to civilian life, working construction jobs and drinking too much, before finally finding some peace in his later years through community involvement and helping other veterans. "War changes people," Marcus said quietly. "But that doesn't mean the change is always bad. Sometimes it teaches you what really matters, what's worth fighting for." Their voices grew fainter as they moved down the hallway, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the half-finished guest room. She found herself thinking about her grandfather's stories, the way he'd described the bonds formed between soldiers who had to rely on each other for survival. There had been something in Marcus's voice when he talked about war and change that suggested he understood those bonds from personal experience. An hour later, Sarah was putting the finishing touches on the guest suite when her phone buzzed with a text message. Her heart sank as she read the words from her mother's nurse. "Maria had another episode this morning. Blood sugar spiked to 380. We got it under control, but the doctor wants to see you." Sarah sank onto the edge of the perfectly made bed, staring at the message as anxiety coursed through her body. Her mother's diabetes had been getting worse over the past year, requiring increasingly expensive medications and more frequent hospitalizations. Sarah's health insurance through the Whitmores covered most of the costs, but there were always co-pays, prescription fees, and the lost wages from time taken off to handle medical emergencies. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her days maintaining a guest room that cost more to decorate than her mother's annual medical expenses, while worrying about whether she could afford the latest round of treatments that might help stabilize her mother's condition. A soft knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Sarah, everything okay in there?" Marcus's voice carried genuine concern, and Sarah realized she'd been sitting in silence for several minutes. She quickly wiped her eyes and stood up, smoothing down her uniform. "Yes, sorry, just finishing up." But when she opened the door, Marcus's perceptive gaze immediately picked up on her distress. "You sure about that? You look like you just got some bad news." For a moment, Sarah considered deflecting with the usual everything's fine response that had become automatic over the years. But something about Marcus's direct concern, the way he asked the question like her answer actually mattered, made her pause. "My mother's having some health issues," she said finally. "It's complicated." Marcus nodded slowly. "Family stuff usually is. You need to take off early today." The offer surprised Sarah. In 5 years of working for the Whitmores, taking time off for personal emergencies had always been a source of tension, particularly with Victoria, who seemed to view such requests as personal inconveniences rather than legitimate needs. "I should be able to handle it after work," Sarah replied, though she wasn't sure that was true. Sarah, Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. If your mom needs you, she needs you. The guest room looks perfect and everything else can wait. Family comes first. Standing in the doorway of the opulent guest suite, looking at this man who had known her for 3 days and was already showing more consideration for her personal life than her employers had in 5 years, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. It was a small crack in the armor of resignation she'd built around herself, but it was enough to let in a sliver of light. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I really appreciate that." "That's what decent people do for each other," Marcus replied simply. "And Sarah, if you need anything, a ride to the hospital, someone to cover for you tomorrow, whatever, just ask. We look out for each other here. Understood?" As Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave for the hospital, she found herself thinking about Marcus's words. "We look out for each other here." It was such a simple concept, but in her experience, it had been more of an ideal than a reality. For the first time since she'd started working at the Whitmore mansion, Sarah began to wonder what it might feel like to be part of a team rather than just a service provider, to work alongside people who saw her as a person worth protecting rather than just a function to be performed. The afternoon sun streamed through the mansion's windows as Sarah drove toward the hospital, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things were beginning to change. 2 weeks after her mother's latest hospital episode, Sarah found herself standing in the Whitmore kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, staring at a stack of medical bills that seemed to grow larger every time she opened the manila envelope. The morning light filtering through the windows felt harsh and unforgiving, illuminating numbers that didn't add up, no matter how many times she rearranged them in her head. Even with insurance, the copays, specialist visits, and new medications were eating through her savings faster than she could replenish them. Her phone buzzed with another text from the hospital billing department. "Payment overdue. Please contact our office immediately to discuss payment arrangements." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to center herself before the family woke up and expected her to be the seamless, invisible presence they'd grown accustomed to. "You're here early, even for you." Sarah spun around to find Marcus standing in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. His dark eyes took in the papers scattered across the counter and the tense set of her shoulders with the kind of perceptive awareness she was beginning to associate with his military background. "I could say the same about you," Sarah replied, quickly gathering the bills and stuffing them back into the envelope. "Everything okay with security?" Marcus poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she'd already prepared and leaned against the counter, his presence somehow both protective and non-threatening. "Had some contractors here yesterday installing additional cameras around the perimeter. Wanted to do a final check of the system before the family wakes up." He gestured toward the envelope in her hands. "Medical bills?" The direct question caught Sarah off guard. She'd grown so accustomed to the Whitmore family's complete lack of interest in her personal life that having someone notice her distress and actually ask about it felt both comforting and unsettling. "My mother's diabetes is getting worse," she admitted, setting the envelope aside. "The new medication alone costs $800 a month, even with insurance." Marcus's expression darkened. $800 a month for medication she needs to survive. "The doctor says it's one of the newer insulin formulations, more effective at preventing complications, but effective doesn't mean affordable." Sarah managed a wry smile that didn't reach her eyes. "At least not for people like us." "People like us," Marcus repeated thoughtfully. "You know, I spent 12 years in the Marines. Served 3 tours overseas, came back with enough metal in my leg to set off airport security detectors. The VA covers most of my medical care, but I've seen plenty of good people bankrupted by medical bills for things that weren't their fault." There was something in his voice that suggested personal experience, with the gap between what insurance covered and what real life cost. Sarah found herself studying his face, wondering about the stories behind his steady demeanor and the way he seemed to understand struggles that the Whitmore family couldn't even imagine. "I keep telling myself it's temporary," Sarah said, starting her morning prep routine with practiced efficiency, "that maybe the new treatment will stabilize her condition and we can get back to a manageable situation. But you're running out of temporary, aren't you?" The quiet understanding in Marcus's voice almost undid her carefully maintained composure. Sarah focused on measuring coffee grounds, using the familiar task to keep her hands steady and her voice level. "I'm looking into some financial assistance programs through the hospital, and there might be some state aid she qualifies for. It's just the paperwork, the waiting, the bureaucracy. It all takes time, and in the meantime, the bills keep coming." Marcus was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee and watching her work. You ever think about asking the Whitmores for help? Advance on your salary, maybe? Or some kind of emergency assistance? Sarah's laugh held no humor. You've met Victoria. What do you think? I think Charles might surprise you. He seems like a decent man, even if he's distracted by other things. Charles is dealing with his own health issues and business problems, and even if he wanted to help, Victoria controls the household finances. She made it very clear when I started that personal emergencies are not the family's responsibility. The sound of footsteps upstairs indicated that the household was beginning to stir. Sarah automatically shifted into her morning routine, but Marcus didn't move toward the door like she expected. Sarah, he said quietly, if you need someone to help you navigate those financial assistance programs, or if you need a reference for anything, I'm here. I've dealt with enough bureaucracy to know how to make the system work when it doesn't want to. Before Sarah could respond, Victoria's voice echoed down the hallway. Sarah, where's my coffee and why isn't the newspaper on the breakfast table? Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she called back with professional calm. Coming right up, Mrs. Whitmore. Marcus watched this interaction with interest, his eyes narrowing slightly at Victoria's imperious tone. She always talked to you like that. It's fine, Sarah replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't. No, it's not fine, but I'm beginning to understand the dynamics around here. Over the next few hours, Marcus observed the household routine with the analytical eye of someone trained to assess threats and vulnerabilities. He watched Victoria dismiss Sarah's suggestions about Dylan's schedule with an impatient wave of her hand. He listened to her complain loudly on the phone about how difficult it is to find good help these days, while Sarah was clearly within earshot, reorganizing the pantry. He saw her leave her coffee cup on whatever surface was convenient, knowing Sarah would clean it up without being asked. The breaking point came during lunch preparation. Sarah was assembling Victoria's elaborate salad, organic greens that cost $12 a pound, imported cheese, and exotic fruits that required special ordering, when Victoria swept into the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. No, the flowers for the centerpieces must be white orchids, not regular ones. Do you have any idea how much I'm paying for this event? Victoria paused her conversation long enough to snap at Sarah. That salad better be perfect. I'm having lunch with the museum board, and they notice everything. Sarah nodded and continued working, but Victoria wasn't finished. And Sarah, after lunch, I need you to reorganize my entire walk-in closet. I'm donating some pieces to the charity auction, and everything needs to be perfectly sorted by season and color. It should only take you a few hours if you're efficient about it. A few hours. Sarah's mother had another doctor's appointment that afternoon, one that had been scheduled for weeks. She'd been planning to use her lunch break to drive to the medical center and handle some insurance paperwork that couldn't be done over the phone. Mrs. Whitmore, I was hoping to take my lunch break a little longer today. I have some personal business. Personal business? Victoria's voice rose sharply. Sarah, your personal business is exactly that. Personal. When you're here, your focus should be on your job. The closet organization can't wait. I understand, but this is a medical appointment for my mother that... I'm sorry, but that's not my problem. Victoria's tone was ice cold. If you can't manage your personal life around your work schedule, perhaps this position isn't the right fit for you. The implicit threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah felt her carefully maintained professional demeanor crack, 5 years of swallowed frustrations and dismissive treatment crystallizing into a moment of painful clarity. Around her, the kitchen's marble surfaces and high-end appliances seemed to mock her with their casual display of wealth that could solve her mother's medical crisis without anyone in this family even noticing the expense. Mrs. Whitmore, Sarah said carefully, I've never missed a day of work in 5 years. I've covered holidays, weekends, and emergency situations without complaint. I'm asking for 2 hours to help my mother navigate a medical crisis, and I'm telling you that your personal problems are not my responsibility. Your job is to maintain this household, and right now, that means organizing my closet. If you can't handle that, I can find someone who can. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Sarah stared at Victoria's perfectly made-up face, seeing the complete absence of empathy or basic human decency. For 5 years, she'd told herself that Victoria's behavior was just stress, or the pressure of managing multiple social obligations, or the natural result of living in a bubble of privilege. But standing in this kitchen, being threatened with losing her job for asking to care for her sick mother, Sarah finally saw the truth. Victoria simply didn't see her as a person whose needs mattered. I'll take care of the closet, Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Victoria smiled with satisfaction and returned to her phone call as if the conversation had never happened. Sarah finished preparing the salad with mechanical precision, each movement automatic, while her mind reeled with the implications of what had just occurred. She was so focused on maintaining her composure that she didn't notice Marcus standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat softly. His expression was carefully neutral, but something dangerous flickered in his dark eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Marcus's voice was respectful but firm. "I need to discuss some security protocols with you when you have a moment." Victoria glanced up from her phone with mild annoyance. "Can't it wait? I have a very important lunch meeting." "It's regarding the safety of your family, ma'am. I don't think it should wait." Something in Marcus's tone made Victoria pause. She ended her phone call and turned to face him fully. "What kind of safety concerns?" "The kind that require all household staff to be alert and focused, which means making sure they're not distracted by personal emergencies that could have been handled with a little flexibility." Marcus's words were carefully chosen, but his meaning was clear. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Thompson." "I'm not implying anything, ma'am. I'm stating that a security protocol includes making sure essential personnel can handle personal emergencies without compromising their ability to maintain household operations. Sarah is essential personnel." The designation hit Sarah like a physical shock. Essential personnel. In 12 years of military service, Marcus had learned to identify the people who kept operations running smoothly, and he was applying that same assessment to the civilian world of the Whitmore household. Victoria looked between Marcus and Sarah, clearly uncomfortable with having her treatment of the staff questioned by someone she couldn't simply dismiss. "I think you're overstepping your boundaries, Mr. Thompson." "Maybe, but in my experience, the people who keep things running deserve to be treated like the valuable assets they are." Marcus met Victoria's gaze steadily. "Sarah hasn't missed a day of work in 5 years. Seems like the kind of dedication that earns some flexibility when life happens." The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft hum of expensive appliances. Sarah stood frozen between the two of them, hardly daring to breathe as she watched this unprecedented challenge to Victoria's authority play out. Finally, Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Fine, take your 2 hours, Sarah. But the closet gets organized today, even if you have to stay late to finish it." It wasn't gracious and it certainly wasn't kind, but it was more than Victoria had ever conceded before. Sarah nodded quickly. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll make sure everything gets done." As Victoria stalked out of the kitchen, her heels clicking angrily against the marble floor, Sarah found herself alone with Marcus and the profound realization that someone had just fought for her, not because they had to, but because they believed she deserved basic human decency. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotions she was struggling to contain. "You didn't have to do that." Marcus shrugged as if challenging entitled employers was just another part of his daily routine. "Yeah, I did. That's what decent people do. They stand up for each other when someone's being treated badly. She's going to make my life difficult now." "Probably. But Sarah." Marcus turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Your life was already difficult. At least now she knows you're not alone in this house." As Sarah hurried to change clothes and grab her car keys, she found herself thinking about Marcus's words. For 5 years, she had been alone in this house, isolated by class differences and the invisible barriers that separated the help from the helped. But something fundamental had shifted in the past few minutes. Someone had seen her worth and been willing to defend it, even at the cost of workplace harmony. Driving toward the medical center with the afternoon sun streaming through her windshield, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that she might deserve better than what she'd been accepting. It was a dangerous thought, one that threatened to upend the careful resignation she'd built around herself like armor. But as she pulled into the hospital parking lot, ready to fight another round with insurance companies and billing departments for her mother's care, Sarah carried with her the echo of Marcus's voice. "You're not alone in this house." For the first time in a long time, that felt like it might actually be true. The atmosphere in the Whitmore mansion had been noticeably tense for the 3 days following Marcus's confrontation with Victoria. Sarah could feel the change in the air, like the static electricity that preceded a thunderstorm, crackling with unspoken tensions and carefully avoided eye contact. Victoria's interactions with her had become icily professional, each request delivered with the precision of someone who knew exactly how far they could push without creating grounds for complaint. Sarah was reorganizing the library's extensive collection of first edition books when she overheard heated voices coming from Charles's study down the hallway. The heavy oak doors were slightly ajar, and despite her better judgment, she found herself pausing to listen as the conversation grew more intense. "Absolutely unacceptable, Charles. That security guard of yours completely undermined my authority in front of the staff." Victoria's voice carried the sharp edge it always acquired when she felt her control being challenged. "His name is Marcus Victoria, and he's the head of security, not a guard." Charles's response sounded tired, as if this conversation had been ongoing for longer than Sarah realized. And from what I understand, he was simply advocating for reasonable accommodation for a valuable employee. "Valuable employee?" Victoria's laugh was brittle and cold. "Charles, she's a housekeeper. They're replaceable. There are dozens of women who would be grateful for the position." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. After 5 years of dedicated service, of learning every family preference and managing countless details that made their lives run smoothly, Victoria still saw her as nothing more than an interchangeable service provider. "That's enough, Victoria." Charles's voice carried a firmness that Sarah rarely heard from him. "Sarah has been with us for 5 years. She's reliable, trustworthy, and Dylan adores her. More importantly, she's a human being dealing with a family crisis, and basic decency requires us to show some flexibility." "Basic decency?" Victoria's voice rose sharply. "What about basic respect for the people who pay her salary? I won't be lectured about employee management by someone whose own business is falling apart." The silence that followed Victoria's cutting remark was so profound that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. She knew Charles's tech company had been struggling with some kind of corporate espionage situation, but she hadn't realized the extent of the problems. "My business troubles have nothing to do with how we treat the people who work in our home," Charles said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "And if you can't understand the difference between authority and cruelty, then perhaps you need to examine your own values." The sound of a door slamming made Sarah jump, and she quickly returned to her book organizing as footsteps echoed in the hallway. A few moments later, Charles appeared in the library doorway, his usually composed demeanor visibly shaken. His silver hair was disheveled, and the stress lines around his eyes seemed deeper than they had been even a week ago. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a weight of exhaustion, "I owe you an apology." The unexpected words made Sarah look up from the leather-bound volume she'd been pretending to examine. "Mr. Whitmore?" Charles entered the library and closed the door behind him, then walked to one of the tall windows that overlooked the meticulously maintained gardens. For a long moment he stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him in a posture that spoke of a man carrying burdens he couldn't share. "I've been so focused on my own problems that I haven't been paying attention to what's happening in my own household," he said finally. "Marcus brought some things to my attention, and I realized I've been failing in my responsibilities as an employer and as a human being." Sarah set down the book, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented level of personal revelation from her employer. "Mr. Whitmore, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Charles turned to face her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that looked like genuine regret. "Victoria told me about your mother's medical situation, though not in the context I would have hoped. I had no idea you were dealing with such significant expenses." The careful control Sarah had maintained over her emotions for the past week began to crack. "I try not to let personal issues affect my work, and that's exactly the problem," Charles said, moving to sit in one of the library's leather armchairs and gesturing for Sarah to do the same. "You shouldn't have to choose between caring for your family and keeping your job. The fact that you've been managing both for 5 years without complaint says more about your character than it does about our management." Sarah perched on the edge of a chair across from him, still unsure where this conversation was heading. In 5 years of employment, she and Charles had never had anything approaching a personal conversation. "I want to help," Charles continued. "I should have offered before now, but I've been distracted by other matters. How much do you need to get your mother's medical situation stabilized?" The direct question caught Sarah completely off guard. She stared at Charles, trying to process the idea that he was offering financial assistance. "Mr. Whitmore, I couldn't accept." "Sarah, do you know what my wife spent on flowers for last month's dinner party?" Charles's smile was rueful. $3,000 for flowers that were thrown away the next day. "I think we can manage to help with medical expenses for someone who's been taking care of our family for 5 years. The numbers didn't compute in Sarah's mind. $3,000 for a single evening's decoration, enough to cover 2 months of her mother's medication, or a specialist consultation, or the dental work her mother had been putting off because insurance didn't cover it. The medication costs about $800 a month, Sarah said quietly, and there are some specialist visits that insurance doesn't fully cover. Maybe another $1,000 over the next few months if we're careful. Charles nodded as if these amounts were insignificant, which Sarah realized they probably were to someone of his wealth. Consider it handled. I'll have my accountant set up a medical assistance account that you can draw from as needed. Mr. Whitmore, I don't know what to say. This is incredibly generous, but I don't want you to think I was looking for charity. It's not charity, Sarah. It's recognition of value. Charles leaned forward, his expression serious. Marcus made me realize something important. He said that in the military, you take care of the people who take care of you. It's not just good strategy. It's basic human decency. The mention of Marcus sent a warm flutter through Sarah's chest. She was beginning to understand that his intervention had been more far-reaching than she'd initially realized. There's something else, Charles continued. I've been thinking about your background, your education. Marcus mentioned that you have a master's degree in education from UCLA. Sarah felt a familiar pang of regret at the mention of her abandoned teaching career. Yes, but that was a long time ago. I haven't been in a classroom in years. What if that could change? Charles asked. Dylan's been struggling with his regular tutors. They don't seem to connect with him the way you do. His grades have been slipping, and Victoria's solution is to hire more expensive specialists who treat him like a problem to be solved rather than a child to be understood. The implications of Charles's words began to sink in. Are you offering me a different position? I'm offering you an additional position. Keep your current responsibilities if you want them, but add educational support for Dylan. Formal tutoring, homework assistance, maybe even some broader academic guidance. The pay would reflect the additional skills and responsibilities, of course. Sarah felt as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. The opportunity to use her educational background again, to work with Dylan in an official capacity, rather than just helping him in stolen moments, it was more than she had dared to hope for. What would Mrs. Whitmore think about this arrangement? Sarah asked carefully. Knowing that Victoria's approval would be crucial to making any new arrangement work, Charles's expression hardened slightly. Victoria doesn't get a vote in this decision. Dylan is my son. His education is my responsibility, and you're the person he trusts and responds to. That's all that matters. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, followed by Dylan's voice calling out, "Dad, I'm home." "In the library, son," Charles called back, and within moments Dylan burst through the doorway with the boundless energy of an 8-year-old who'd been confined to a classroom all day. "Hey, Sarah!" Dylan's face lit up with genuine joy at seeing her. "Guess what? I got an A on my history test, the one about World War II that you helped me study for." "That's wonderful, Dylan," Sarah replied, feeling a surge of pride at his accomplishment. "You worked really hard on that project." Mrs. Peterson said it was one of the best reports she'd ever seen from a third grader. She said, "I really understood how the war affected regular people, not just the famous generals and stuff." Charles watched this interaction with interest, noting the easy rapport between Sarah and his son. "Dylan, how would you feel if Sarah became your official tutor, someone who could help you with all your subjects, not just when you have questions?" Dylan's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? That would be awesome. Sarah explains things way better than Mr. Henderson, and she doesn't get all frustrated when I don't understand something right away." "Then it's settled," Charles said, standing up with the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him in weeks. "Sarah, we'll work out the details of your new responsibilities and compensation over the next few days. In the meantime, consider your mother's medical expenses covered." As Charles headed toward his study to handle some business calls, Dylan plopped down in the chair his father had vacated, his face serious despite his earlier enthusiasm. "Sarah," he said quietly, "is it true that Mum wants to fire you?" The question hit Sarah like a cold wind. "What makes you think that, Dylan?" "I heard her talking to Mrs. Caldwell on the phone yesterday. She said something about finding more suitable household staff and how some people don't know their place." Dylan's voice carried the weight of a child who understood more about adult dynamics than anyone realized. "I don't want you to leave. You're the only grown-up here who actually listens to me." Sarah felt her heart break a little at Dylan's words. The idea that this 8-year-old felt more understood by the housekeeper than by his own parents spoke to problems that went far deeper than employee relations. "Dylan, whatever happens between your parents and me, you need to know that you're a smart, kind, wonderful kid. Don't let anyone make you feel like your thoughts and feelings don't matter. But you're not leaving, right? Especially now that Dad wants you to be my tutor. Sarah looked at Dylan's hopeful face and felt the weight of promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The truth was that Victoria's hostility had reached a new level, and Charles's support, while meaningful, might not be enough to overcome his wife's determination to reassert control over the household. "I'm going to do everything I can to stay," Sarah said finally. "But Dylan, even if circumstances change, remember that the confidence you've built in yourself, that belongs to you. No one can take that away." As the afternoon sun slanted through the library windows, casting long shadows across the expensive Persian rugs and leather-bound books, Sarah found herself at a crossroads she hadn't seen coming. Charles's offer represented an opportunity to reclaim part of her professional identity and secure her mother's medical care. But it also meant navigating Victoria's increasing hostility and the complex dynamics of a family that was clearly struggling with its own internal conflicts. The sound of Marcus's motorcycle pulling up outside drew Sarah's attention to the window. She watched him dismount and remove his helmet, his movements efficient and controlled. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up toward the library window and raised his hand in a brief wave that somehow managed to convey support and solidarity across the distance. "Marcus is really cool," Dylan observed, following her gaze. "He actually talks to me like I'm a real person, not just some kid who's in the way. Kinda like you do." Sarah smiled at the comparison, recognizing the truth in Dylan's observation. Both she and Marcus seemed to understand what it felt like to be underestimated or overlooked, and both had found ways to see the value in others that society often missed. As evening approached and the household began its familiar rhythm of dinner preparation and family routines, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that everything was about to change. Charles's offer represented hope and opportunity, but it also meant stepping into a more visible role that would inevitably bring her into direct conflict with Victoria's vision of proper household hierarchy. Standing in the library, surrounded by books that represented centuries of human knowledge and wisdom, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week ago. She was going to accept Charles's offer, claim her place as Dylan's tutor, and stop apologizing for taking up space in a world that had tried to make her invisible. For the first time in 5 years, Sarah Martinez was ready to be seen. The confrontation Sarah had been dreading arrived on a Thursday morning in November, when the Santa Ana winds howled through the canyons and the air crackled with the kind of dry tension that made everything feel combustible. She was setting up Dylan's new tutoring space in the mansion's sunroom, a bright, airy space that Charles had designated for their educational sessions, when Victoria's heels clicked across the marble floor with the staccato rhythm of approaching war. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Victoria stood in the doorway of the sunroom, her perfectly styled hair and designer suit a stark contrast to the fury radiating from her pale blue eyes. In her hands, she clutched a manila folder that Sarah recognized as personnel files from Charles's home office. "I'm preparing for Dylan's tutoring session," Sarah replied calmly, though her heart rate spiked as she recognized the dangerous edge in Victoria's voice. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to set up a dedicated learning space." "Mr. Whitmore," Victoria's voice dripped with disdain as she stepped into the room, her presence somehow making the spacious sunroom feel claustrophobic. "Let me be very clear about something, Sarah. I don't care what my husband said in some moment of misguided sympathy. This household runs according to my standards, and you are overstepping your boundaries in ways that I will not tolerate." Sarah straightened to her full height, drawing on reserves of strength she was still learning she possessed. 2 weeks ago, this confrontation would have sent her into immediate damage control mode, apologizing and scrambling to find a solution that wouldn't upset the household balance, but something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of her own worth. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm following Mr. Whitmore's direct instructions regarding Dylan's education. If you have concerns about the arrangement, perhaps you should discuss them with him." Victoria's laugh was sharp and cold. "Oh, I intend to. But first, I think we need to have a conversation about your future here, or rather, your lack of one." The folder in Victoria's hands landed on the small table Sarah had been arranging with Dylan's textbooks and supplies. Sarah could see her own employment documents through the clear plastic cover, along with what looked like performance evaluations and incident reports. "I've been documenting your behavior over the past month," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the business-like tone she used when she wanted to sound official and intimidating. "Insubordination, failure to complete assigned tasks in a timely manner, inappropriate involvement in family decisions that are none of your concern." Insubordination. Sarah felt a flare of anger that she didn't try to suppress. Mrs. Whitmore, I've never refused a direct order or failed to complete my responsibilities, haven't you? When I asked you to reorganize my closet immediately, you insisted on prioritizing your personal business instead. When I've given you specific instructions about household management, you've questioned my decisions and involved other staff members in discussions that were none of their business. Victoria was rewriting history, Sarah realized, turning Marcus's intervention and Charles's support into evidence of Sarah's supposed misconduct. It was a calculated attempt to justify what Victoria had apparently already decided to do. More importantly, Victoria continued, you've been undermining the proper hierarchy of this household. Dylan needs structure and discipline, not someone who indulges his every whim and fills his head with ideas about how special and misunderstood he is. The attack on her relationship with Dylan hit Sarah harder than any personal criticism could have. Dylan is a bright, sensitive child who responds well to encouragement and intellectual challenge. My approach to his education is based on proven pedagogical methods, and your approach is based on the delusion that you're qualified to make decisions about my son's upbringing. Victoria's voice cut through Sarah's explanation like a blade. You're a housekeeper, Sarah. A housekeeper with some college education, perhaps, but still just someone we pay to clean and maintain our home. The fact that my husband has temporarily lost sight of appropriate boundaries doesn't change your actual role here. The words stung because they echoed Sarah's own deepest fears, that she was reaching beyond her place, that she had misunderstood the nature of the Whitmores' regard for her, that she was fundamentally fooling herself about her own worth and capabilities. I think it's time for you to find a position that's more suited to your actual qualifications, Victoria continued, opening the folder and pulling out what looked like a termination letter. I'm prepared to offer you a generous severance package and excellent references, provided you leave quietly and don't attempt to poison Dylan's mind against his family. Sarah stared at the letter Victoria extended toward her, the formal language blurring slightly as the implications sank in. Termination of employment, 2 weeks severance pay, immediate departure required. After 5 years of dedicated service, of learning every family preference and managing countless crises, Victoria was dismissing her like a piece of unwanted furniture. You can't do this, Sarah said quietly, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. I absolutely can do this. I'm the one who manages this household, and I decide who works here and who doesn't. Charles may have had some momentary lapse in judgment, but he'll understand when I explain the situation properly. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted Victoria's triumphant monologue. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his dark eyes immediately taking in the tense scene and the termination letter in Victoria's hand. Ladies, he said politely, though something in his tone suggested he was fully aware of what was happening. Mrs. Whitmore, Charles is looking for you in his study. He said it was urgent. Victoria's jaw tightened with annoyance. I'm in the middle of handling a personnel matter, Mr. Thompson. It can wait. I don't think it can, ma'am. He seemed pretty insistent. Marcus stepped further into the room, his presence somehow changing the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Something about the security protocols we discussed yesterday. For a moment, Victoria wavered between her desire to finish destroying Sarah's employment and her need to respond to her husband's summons. The mention of security protocols seemed to tip the balance, perhaps reminding her of the ongoing business threats that had necessitated Marcus's hiring in the first place. This conversation isn't over, Victoria said to Sarah, leaving the termination letter on the table like a weapon she intended to return for later. We'll finish this discussion when I get back. As Victoria's footsteps faded down the hallway, Sarah sank into one of the child-sized chairs she'd arranged for Dylan's tutoring sessions, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The termination letter sat on the table like a poisonous thing, its official language reducing 5 years of her life to a personnel decision. She can't actually fire you, you know, Marcus said quietly, closing the sunroom door behind him and moving to sit across from Sarah. Not without Charles's approval. The household staff budget comes from his accounts, not hers. She seems pretty confident that she can get Charles to agree. Sarah's voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. And maybe she's right. Maybe I have been overstepping. Maybe I don't belong in this world after all. Marcus leaned forward, his brown eyes intense with the kind of focused attention she was beginning to associate with his military background. Sarah, look at me. Look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his, surprised by the fierce certainty she saw there. You are not overstepping. You are not out of place. You are a highly educated, incredibly capable woman who has been systematically undervalued and marginalized by someone who sees your competence as a threat to her own sense of importance. Marcus's voice was steady and sure, each word carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Do not let her rewrite the story of who you are. But what if Charles agrees with her? What if he decides that maintaining household harmony is more important than keeping me around? Then Charles would be making the biggest mistake of his life, both as an employer and as a father. Marcus reached across the table and took her hands in his, the unexpected contact sending warmth through her entire body. But I don't think that's going to happen. Charles isn't stupid, and he's not blind. He knows what you mean to this family, even if his wife refuses to see it. Sarah found herself studying Marcus's face, noting the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners and the small scar above his left eyebrow that spoke of old injuries and hard-won experience. There was something in his expression that went beyond professional support or even friendship, a protective fierceness that made her feel, for the first time in years, like someone was truly in her corner. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Fighting for me, I mean. You barely know me, and taking my side is only going to make your job more difficult." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that she hadn't heard from him before. 12 years ago, I was a 22-year-old Marine stationed in Afghanistan, convinced I was invincible and that I understood how the world worked. Then I got caught in an IED explosion that shattered my left leg and put me in a field hospital for 3 months. Sarah listened, understanding that he was sharing something important, something that explained the careful way he sometimes moved and the watchful quality in his eyes. "The doctors told me I'd probably never walk normally again, that my military career was over, that I needed to start thinking about what else I could do with my life. I was angry, depressed, ready to give up on everything. And then this nurse, Maria Santos, started working my ward." Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his serious features. Maria was about 50, had been working in military hospitals for 20 years, and she took one look at me feeling sorry for myself and told me I was wasting everyone's time, including my own. She said I could choose to be a victim of what happened to me, or I could choose to be a warrior who had been given new battles to fight. What did you do? I chose to be a warrior. Maria helped me understand that strength isn't about being invincible. It's about getting back up when life knocks you down, and then helping other people do the same thing. Marcus's hands tightened slightly around hers. That's what I see when I look at you, Sarah. Someone who has been knocked down repeatedly by people who should have been supporting you, but who keeps getting back up and taking care of everyone around you anyway. The sunroom fell quiet, except for the sound of wind rustling through the palm trees outside. Sarah felt something profound shifting inside her chest, a recognition that the way Marcus saw her might actually be closer to the truth than her own self-doubt. Maria used to say that the people with real strength are usually the ones who don't even realize how strong they are, Marcus continued. They're too busy taking care of everyone else to notice their own courage. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of raised voices echoed from the direction of Charles's study. Even through the closed doors and down the long hallway, they could hear the sharp edge of an argument in progress. "Sounds like Victoria found Charles," Marcus observed, releasing Sarah's hands and standing up. "This might be a good time for you to disappear for a while. Take a walk, run some errands, let them work this out without you in the middle of it." Sarah stood as well, glancing at the termination letter that still lay on the table like evidence of her uncertain future. What if she wins? What if Charles decides it's easier to let me go than to deal with the conflict? Marcus moved closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of his soap and see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. For a moment, she thought he might touch her face or pull her into an embrace, but instead, he simply held her gaze with unwavering certainty. Then she wins a battle, but she loses the war. Because Sarah Martinez, the real Sarah Martinez, not the one who's been hiding behind other people's limitations, is not going anywhere. She's just getting started. As Sarah gathered her purse and jacket, preparing to leave the battlefield while others fought for her future, she carried with her the echo of Marcus's words and the growing understanding that maybe, just maybe, she had spent 5 years apologizing for strengths that other people found threatening. The afternoon sun slanted through the sunroom windows as she walked toward her car, and for the first time since Victoria had appeared with that termination letter, Sarah felt something stronger than fear settling in her chest. She felt ready to fight. Sarah returned to the Whitmore mansion 3 hours later to find an unusual gathering in the living room. Charles sat in his leather armchair, his normally composed demeanor showing signs of strain. Victoria perched on the edge of the white sofa, her perfect posture betraying the tension crackling through her body. Dylan sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, his school backpack abandoned beside him, as he looked between his parents with the worried expression of a child who knew something important was happening, but didn't understand what. Marcus stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his stance relaxed but alert, like a soldier maintaining watch. When Sarah entered the room, all eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of unspoken decisions hanging in the air like morning fog over the canyon. "Sarah," Charles said, rising from his chair with visible effort, "please sit down. We need to talk." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing as Sarah chose a chair that put her roughly equidistant from all the family members. The positioning felt deliberate, as if she were being asked to sit in judgment rather than simply listen to one. "I understand Victoria spoke with you earlier about your employment here," Charles began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone navigating treacherous waters. "I want you to know that I was not consulted about that conversation, nor did I approve any changes to your position." "Charles," Victoria started, but he held up a hand that stopped her mid-sentence. "I also want you to know that over the past several days, I've been doing some thinking about this household, about how we function as a family, and about the role you've played in our lives." Charles moved to stand behind Dylan, his hands resting protectively on his son's shoulders. "What I've realized is that you haven't just been taking care of our house, Sarah. You've been taking care of us." Dylan looked up at his father with surprise, as if this was the first time he'd heard his dad acknowledge what the 8-year-old had understood for years. "You've anticipated our needs, solved our problems, and maintained our family's daily life with a level of dedication and competence that goes far beyond what we had any right to expect." Charles's voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if voicing these truths was giving him clarity about decisions he needed to make. "More than that, you've provided Dylan with the kind of patient, thoughtful guidance that has helped him flourish academically and personally." "Charles, this is hardly the time for performance reviews," Victoria interjected, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "We've already discussed the inappropriate boundaries and the need for more suitable arrangements." "Actually, Victoria, this is exactly the time for performance reviews, because I've spent the morning looking at Dylan's grades, talking to his teachers and reviewing the household accounts." Charles's tone carried an edge that Sarah had never heard before. "Did you know that Dylan's reading comprehension scores have improved by 30% since Sarah started helping him with his homework, or that his math grades have gone from C's to A's?" Dylan beamed at this recognition of his academic progress, but Victoria's expression grew more pinched. "I also discovered that Sarah has been managing household expenses with remarkable efficiency, finding ways to reduce costs without compromising quality. The grocery bills alone have decreased by 15% over the past year, despite inflation." Charles looked directly at his wife. "Meanwhile, you spent $4,000 last month on a single shopping trip to Rodeo Drive." The comparison hung in the air like an indictment. Sarah felt uncomfortable being used as ammunition in what was clearly a larger marital conflict, but she also recognized that Charles was fighting for something more significant than just her employment. "What I'm trying to say," Charles continued, his attention returning to Sarah, "is that you deserve far better than what you've been receiving in this household. Better compensation, better treatment, and better recognition for the extraordinary value you bring to our family." Victoria stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "I will not sit here and listen to you lecture me about household management while you elevate the help to some kind of family advisor position. This is exactly the kind of boundary confusion that creates problems. The only boundary confusion here is your inability to recognize human worth when it doesn't come with the right social credentials," Marcus said quietly from his position by the windows. All eyes turned to him, and Sarah felt her heart rate spike at his willingness to enter the family conflict directly. "Excuse me." Victoria's voice could have frozen the Pacific Ocean. Marcus stepped forward, his movement controlled and deliberate. "I've spent 3 weeks observing this household, Mrs. Whitmore. I've watched Sarah manage complex schedules, handle family crises, provide educational support, and maintain this house at a level that would put most 5-star hotels to shame, all while being treated like she's invisible. Mr. Thompson, I think you're overstepping." "No, ma'am, I'm not. I'm doing exactly what Charles hired me to do, protecting this family, and part of that protection involves recognizing threats to family stability and security." Marcus's voice remained respectful but implacable. "Sarah isn't a threat to this family. She's the person who's been holding it together. Victoria looked to her husband, clearly expecting him to control his employee. But Charles remained silent, his expression thoughtful. Furthermore, Marcus continued, I've seen Sarah handle Dylan's academic needs with more skill and patience than most professional tutors. I've watched her manage household crises without drama or complaint, and I've observed her maintain her professionalism and dignity, even when being treated with a level of disrespect that would have sent most people walking out the door years ago. Sarah felt heat flood her cheeks as Marcus's words painted a picture of competence and strength that she was still learning to recognize in herself. That's not the behavior of someone who doesn't know her place, Marcus said, his eyes meeting Victoria's directly. That's the behavior of someone with real strength, someone who's been doing the right thing even when it's hard, even when it's thankless, even when it means sacrificing her own advancement for the good of others. The living room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of traffic on Sunset Boulevard. Dylan looked between the adults with wide eyes, processing a conversation that was revealing more about his family dynamics than he'd ever understood before. Sarah, Charles said finally, I owe you several apologies, but more importantly, I owe you a choice. Victoria believes that maintaining traditional household boundaries is more important than recognizing exceptional people. I disagree. He moved to his desk and pulled out what looked like a formal document. I'm offering you a new position, Director of Household Operations and Educational Services. The salary is triple what you're currently making, with full benefits, 2 weeks paid vacation, and an education fund that will cover any additional training or certification you want to pursue. Sarah stared at the document Charles extended toward her, hardly believing what she was hearing. Director of Household Operations, triple salary, education fund. It was more than she had ever dared to imagine, a recognition of her value that went beyond her wildest hopes. However, Charles continued, I want you to understand that accepting this position means you'll be working in a household where one of the family members fundamentally disagrees with your elevated role. That's not a small thing, and it's not fair to ask you to navigate that kind of ongoing conflict. Victoria's face had gone pale with fury, but she seemed to recognize that the battle had already been lost. The formal offer, made in front of witnesses, would be difficult for her to undermine without creating a much larger conflict with her husband. I need you to make this decision based on what's best for you and your family, Charles added. Not based on what you think we need or want, but based on what you deserve and what will help you build the kind of future you want. Sarah looked around the room, taking in each face. Dylan's hopeful expression clearly desperate for her to stay. Charles's tired but determined features, suggesting a man who had finally decided to take a stand for his values. Victoria's icy disapproval, promising ongoing conflict if Sarah chose to remain. And Marcus, whose steady gaze seemed to be communicating a message she was just beginning to understand. You are stronger than you know. Mrs. Whitmore, Sarah said, turning to face Victoria directly. I want you to know that I've never intended to overstep boundaries or create conflicts in your household. My goal has always been to serve this family to the best of my abilities. Victoria's expression softened slightly, perhaps expecting an apology or a graceful withdrawal. But I also want you to know, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, that I will no longer apologize for being good at my job, for caring about Dylan's education, or for expecting to be treated with basic human dignity. Those aren't boundary violations, they're professional standards. She stood and walked to Charles, accepting the document with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I accept your offer, Mr. Whitmore, and I want you to know that you're not just gaining a director of household operations. You're gaining someone who will fight for this family's well-being as fiercely as I've fought for my own. Dylan whooped with joy and launched himself from the rug to wrap his arms around Sarah's waist. Yes, this is the best day ever. Charles smiled with genuine warmth. Welcome to your new position, Sarah. I think this arrangement is going to benefit everyone involved. Victoria stood without a word and walked toward the staircase, her heels clicking against the marble with sharp, angry precision. At the foot of the stairs, she paused and turned back. Don't expect this to be easy, she said, her voice carrying the promise of continued resistance. Some people in this household still understand the importance of appropriate boundaries. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Whitmore, Marcus said calmly. Some people do understand boundaries. The boundary between employee and family member. The boundary between respect and contempt. The boundary between strength and cruelty. Victoria's face flushed with anger, but she apparently decided that continuing the argument would only diminish her position further. She turned and climbed the stairs without another word. As evening settled over Beverly Hills and the family began their dinner preparations, Sarah found herself in the kitchen with Marcus, both of them working companionably to prepare a meal that felt like a celebration. "So," Marcus said, chopping vegetables with military precision, "Director of Household Operations has a nice ring to it." Sarah smiled, still getting used to the title and everything it represented. "I can hardly believe it's real. 3 weeks ago I was worried about being fired. Now you're exactly where you belong," Marcus finished, "in a position that recognizes your worth and gives you the authority to make the changes this family needs." He set down his knife and turned to face her fully. "Sarah, I want you to know something. What happened in there wasn't just about Charles finally recognizing your value, or even about standing up to Victoria's bullying. What was it about?" Marcus stepped closer, close enough that she could see the warmth in his brown eyes and feel the solid presence of his support. "It was about you finally deciding that you deserve better. Charles offered you that position because you had already started claiming your own worth. He just followed your lead." The kitchen fell quiet, except for the soft bubbling of something simmering on the stove. Sarah found herself looking into Marcus's face and seeing not just the security expert who had defended her, but the man who had helped her recognize her own strength. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." "Thank you for reminding me what real strength looks like," Marcus replied. Maria was right. The people with real strength usually don't realize how strong they are. "But Sarah Martinez, Director of Household Operations," he smiled, the expression transforming his serious features. "I think she's starting to figure it out." As the sun set over the Santa Monica Mountains and the lights of Beverly Hills began to twinkle in the distance, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the deep satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged, doing work that mattered with people who valued her contributions. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer apologizing for taking up space. She was Sarah Martinez, and she had real strength, the kind that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment and the right people to help her recognize it. In the end, that recognition hadn't come from changing who she was, but from finally refusing to be less than who she had always been.